By 1644, after 2 years of civil war, England was being destroyed. Roundheads and Cavaliers were laying waste to their own country. In the north, the King's Cavalier forces were on the run, and as they retreated to York, they torched the surrounding land. Outside the city, the two sides were to fight their greatest battle. This is the story of the Civil War. Not just the English Civil War, but a conflict that engulfed all of Britain and Ireland. A time of terrible bloodshed, political double-dealing, and radical new ideas. The chaos of those years unleashed religious rivalries and clan conflicts in Ireland and Scotland. In England, the country was almost evenly split between Royalist Cavaliers, who supported the King, and the Roundheads, who backed Parliament. The Roundheads had signed a deal with the King's enemies in Scotland, the Covenanters. Together, they had laid siege to York, the Cavaliers' largest stronghold in the north. The King ordered his finest commander, Prince Rupert, to rush to the city and force the Roundheads back. But there was one man who was equally hungry for victory. A brilliant Roundhead cavalry commander called Oliver Cromwell. This was to be the start of the descent of the Three Kingdoms into total war. Now, in July 1644, the two massive armies would meet face to face. The Cavaliers surged forward, tempting the Roundheads away from York and onto Marston Moor. But it was a bluff. Instead of confronting their army, Rupert circled behind the Roundheads and relieved the city. Rupert decided to attack the Roundheads the following day. 50,000 men would fight at the Battle of Marston Moor. Never again would a battle this size be fought on British soil. The Roundhead and Scottish Covenanter forces were trying to regroup after their humiliating withdrawal from the city. Rupert hoped to finish them off by attacking their disarrayed forces in the rear. Rupert needed all the men he could get. As he marched off in pursuit of the Roundheads, Rupert gave orders for the 5,000-strong York garrison to follow on immediately. The garrison's commander was outraged at the young prince's presumptuous request. After a 2-month siege, his exhausted men were in no state to fight a battle. By 11 a.m., Rupert was poised to attack, but the troops from York had yet to join him. Rupert would have to wait, and wait, and wait. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon before the first troops from York began to arrive. It was too little, too late. The Royalists had squandered the element of surprise. As the two armies stood ready on Marston Moor, the Cavaliers' commanders argued over whether to attack. By 7:30 p.m, Rupert decided it was getting too dark to fight and retired his men for the night. On the other side of Marston Moor, the parliamentarian generals had a different idea. They saw the Royalist campfires and decided this was their moment. The Roundhead cavalry commander, Oliver Cromwell, called together his 3,000 horsemen, known as the Ironsides, and charged. Cromwell caught the Cavaliers totally by surprise. They scrambled to remount, but had barely got moving as the Ironsides reached them. Parliamentarian and royalist cavalry met together in a clash of steel. Cromwell's men quickly overwhelmed the Cavaliers. Then disaster struck as Rupert's horse was killed from under him and he scrambled to hide in a nearby bean field. He would play no further part in the battle. Cromwell took his Ironsides right across the field of battle. Again and again, he charged the royalist cavalry, who now fled the field and retreated back to York. The Cavalier infantry were left abandoned on the field. Many ran, but a resolute force of Yorkshiremen, known as the Whitecoats, refused to surrender. Instead, they stood firm as Cromwell's cavalry circled, slashing and killing the foot soldiers. Cromwell described them as stubble beneath our swords. With over 4,000 royalist casualties, many of whom were buried here in this wood, Marston Moor was a great victory for Parliament. Truly, the triumphant Cromwell wrote from the field, England and the Church of God hath had a great favour from the Lord in this great victory given to us, such as the like never was since the war began. Marston Moor was a turning point. A new, deadly force had emerged in the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell is one of history's great dividers. You either love him or hate him. In the words of one contemporary, never man was higher extolled, and never man was baselier reported of and vilified than this man. To understand Cromwell, I think you need to understand where he came from. He was a man of the East Anglian fens. Amongst these wide open spaces, he felt himself alone with his calling. Cromwell was a complicated, introverted, but fanatical soldier for God. At times deeply compassionate to his troops and family. At other times savage and brutal. And from Marston Moor onwards, this brave, bad man would become increasingly central to the Civil War. Cromwell made his name in the 1630s by resisting royal plans for draining the fens. He grew to be a regional figurehead for discontent and became known as Lord of the Fens. Cromwell was not a political or social revolutionary. It was religion which inspired his rebellion. Sometime during the early 1630s, he experienced a spiritual rebirth. Oh, I lived in and loved darkness and hated the light, he wrote. I was the chief of sinners. Living in Ely, with the cathedral dominating the landscape, Cromwell had a strong sense of the presence of God in his life, and it drove him to believe in a divine plan for England, in which he, Cromwell, would play a leading role. And he felt that his own personal salvation depended deeply on defeating a king who was corrupting England's Protestant heritage. Living in the shadow of Ely Cathedral in this form of vicarage could only have added to Cromwell's belief in his divine mission. When Parliament reconvened in 1640, Cromwell was elected MP for Cambridge, and there he began to place himself at the forefront of opposition to the king. During the first 2 years of the Civil War, Cromwell's religious zeal was matched by his display of bravery on the battlefield. And at Marston Moor, he emerged as a brilliant military commander. But what the history books don't tell you is that the dynamic of this war was far more complex than a simple battle between Roundheads and Cavaliers in England. Again and again, it was Charles's three kingdoms colliding into each other which sent the war into new directions. And it was events in Scotland which were now giving Charles new hope. The Scottish Covenanters, led by the Earl of Argyll, had overcommitted themselves. Their invasion of England had opened up a flank in the Highlands, and now forces loyal to the king were uniting together to stab the Covenanters, Parliament's key allies, in the back. The troubles of the 1640s were not confined to England. In Scotland, the Civil War had become as much of a clan feud as a fight between king and parliament. The Covenanters' leader, the Earl of Argyll, was also chief of the powerful Campbell clan. Argyll was allied with Cromwell against King Charles, and he dominated Scotland. The soldier who led the Royalist fight back was James Graham, the Earl of Montrose. Originally, Montrose had been a supporter of the Covenanters, but he turned against them when they allied with the English Parliament. Here at Blair Athol in the Highlands, Montrose brought together the clans willing to fight for King Charles. The first to join were the fearsome Highlanders of the MacDonald clan, eager for any chance to take on the Campbells and their clan chief, the Duke of Argyll. The second were a troop of 2,000 soldiers sent from the Irish MacDonalds to help Montrose in his struggle. Once more, the Western Highlands provided the backdrop for another bout of the ancient Campbell-MacDonald feud. The MacDonalds despised the Campbells with a vengeance, and they formed the core of Montrose's small royalist army. It was this clan feud, more than any loyalty to King Charles, which really motivated Montrose's coalition. Unlike the rather orchestrated battles of Marston Moor and Edge Hill, Montrose ran a guerrilla-style operation. He didn't have all that much cavalry, troop numbers or firepower, but he was a brilliant commander. Audacious and daring, he used his knowledge of the Highland terrain and the agility of his small force to deadly effect. With Argyll away in England, fighting on the side of the Roundheads, Montrose was able to storm through Scotland. He first took Perth, followed by Aberdeen, where his troops subjected the local population to 3 days of looting and killing. In the name of King Charles, Montrose then plunged back into the Highlands and took in Inverary, home to Argyll and the Campbell clan. Humiliated by this attack, Argyll returned to Scotland with a massive Covenanter force and went after Montrose. But over the course of the winter of 1644, Montrose outran Argyll. For over 200 miles, the two men played a deadly game of cat and mouse. When they were both exhausted, Montrose turned the tables. Suddenly the hunted became the hunter. In February 1645, Montrose spied the Covenanter troops here at Inverloch under the shadow of Ben Nevis. But he couldn't possibly take on such a powerful enemy in open battle. So instead, he used his local knowledge of the area to give his small force the strategic advantage. Amazingly, Montrose marched his royalist clansmen 30 miles in 36 hours over some of the roughest terrain in the British Isles. Right round the base of Ben Nevis to get themselves above Argyll's army. They were outnumbered and outgunned 2 to 1, but they caught the Covenanters completely unaware and delivered the most savage wake-up call you could imagine. Out of the mist, Montrose's men let out their MacDonald war cry. "Sons of dogs, come, and we will give you flesh." They charged down and massacred Argyle's men. Over 1,500 were put to the sword. It was a dramatic victory on behalf of King Charles. Argyle was forced to flee. His galley was halfway down the loch by the time Inverlochy Castle fell. The Covenanters were now in turmoil across Scotland. Montrose took the opportunity to give Charles I some advice about how to deal with the Roundheads in England. "The more your Majesty grants," he wrote, "the more will be asked, and I have too much reason to know they will not rest satisfied with making you any less than a king of straw. It is not worthy of a king to treat with rebel subjects while they have the sword in their hands." Victory in Scotland only encouraged the king. Despite his massive defeat at Marston Moor, he still believed he could win the war. But it wasn't long before Charles was in trouble again. In October 1644, he was trapped at Newbury by the Roundhead army. Yet somehow, the parliamentarians let the king escape. It was a costly mistake, and here at Donnington Castle, only a few miles from Newbury, they made another. Having taken the castle, the Roundheads allowed the Cavaliers to slip back in and retrieve their stores of arms and munitions. At Donnington Castle, the Roundheads stared victory in the face and blinked. After 3 years of war, many of the Roundhead leaders no longer seemed hungry for the fight. The decision to re-engage the Cavaliers hopelessly divided the Parliamentarian Council of War. Alliances often have a tendency to crumble in the face of victory. Just like the Allied powers after success in the Gulf War, not knowing whether to go after Saddam Hussein, the parliamentarians were totally split over just how far to pursue the king. The defeatist Earl of Manchester advised against attacking the king. "In fighting, we venture all to nothing," he said. "If we fight 100 times and beat him 99 times, he will still be king. If he beats us once, or the last time, we shall be hanged." Oliver Cromwell was far more bellicose. "My lord, if this be so, why did we take up arms at first?" What divided Cromwell from Manchester and Essex was religion. Cromwell and his Puritan supporters demanded a root and branch reform of the Church of England, while the parliamentary old guard merely wanted to protect the Church from Charles's innovations. As the debate became more heated, Manchester accused Cromwell of being a dangerous radical. "Is this the liberty we claim to vindicate by shedding our blood?" he asked. "Posterity will say that to deliver them from the yoke of the king, we have subjugated them to that of the common people." What began as an attempt to rein in the power of the king and defend the Church of England was now looking like class warfare. Cromwell knew whoever controlled the army would ultimately win the argument. He planned to usurp the old guard and remodel the army in his image. In December 1644, the Commons passed the Self-Denying Ordinance. This legislation excluded all MPs and peers from commanding the Roundhead army, all except Cromwell himself. The old guard was simply brushed aside. The Roundheads were mostly poorly paid conscripts. Many were reluctant soldiers, forced into fighting by powerful landlords. The army was split into regional divisions with no clear chain of command. Cromwell knew the army would have to change if Parliament was to win the war.
In its place emerged a new model army under the united command of Sir Thomas Fairfax, the leader of parliamentary troops in the north and a hero of Marston Moor. The new model army was more mobile, flexible and deadly. But its egalitarian social composition led opponents foolishly to dismiss it as an unskilled peasant army. One MP scathingly remarked, "The colonels are tradesmen, brewers, tailors, goldsmiths, shoemakers and the like."
Today's modern army is in many ways a descendant of the new model army of the 1640s. Most importantly, it was professional and it was disciplined.
With haste, gentlemen! Fall in on the colour!
The new model army soldiers would be paid regularly, promoted on merit and trained properly.
It's hard now to imagine running an army in any other way, but in the 17th century, this marked a radical break from the amateurism of the past.
Brethren, know this, thou shalt not be cupshotten as thou hast been to the land.
Like any religiously inspired force, from the Crusaders to the Taliban, the new model army's strength lay in its total commitment to a cause.
Have they wasted money? Well, you may hang your head in shame.
They were determined to cleanse England of Catholicism.
You make painted likenesses. I go forth from this place and sin no more.
The creation of this new army signalled a reborn determination to bring the war to a conclusion. Crucially, Fairfax's commission, unlike the original orders given to the Earl of Essex, did not contain a clause for the defence of the King's person. The Roundheads were now after Charles Stuart himself.
Despite the Roundheads' new militancy, the king still believed total victory remained in his sights. But as Charles amused himself with games, the new model army was closing in. On June the 12th, 1645, Cavalier scouts discovered that the new model army was only 5 miles away. The battle that took place a few hours later near a small village in Northamptonshire would be the most decisive of the Civil War.
2 miles south of Market Harborough, among the ridges, streams and small hills that surround the village of Naseby, the Cavaliers chose to turn and fight the encroaching parliamentarian army.
Almost at once, the Cavaliers had the Roundheads on the ropes. But the discipline of the new model army soon began to tell, and the Roundheads launched a powerful counterattack.
At its forefront was Oliver Cromwell. His cavalry poured down upon the infantry, charging and recharging as the royalist army collapsed into chaos and confusion. The fleeing royalists were given no chance to regroup. The Roundhead cavalry pushed on in a merciless pursuit, cutting them down on the road to Leicester. As they plundered their way through the royalist baggage train, they discovered hundreds of cowering women, the wives and mistresses of the royalist troops.
Over 100 were slaughtered outright by the Roundheads, who wrongly believed them to be Irish Catholics. Those who were spared had their faces slashed to mark them out as prostitutes.
Something had changed. It wasn't just the appearance of the new model army, but under Cromwell, a new religious fervour was expressing itself in a bloody and terrible way. Naseby was a catastrophe for the royalists. Charles lost all his guns, all his infantry, and most of his baggage train. Crucially, copies of his secret correspondence were also captured, exposing him as a monarch, happy to do deals with Irish papists and even French mercenaries in the desperate hope of saving his crown.
Apart from a few remaining strongholds, Naseby signalled the end of the Cavaliers as a military force.
Charles's defeat at Naseby also had an effect on the war in Scotland. The Earl of Montrose's luck finally ran out when he found himself outnumbered 3-1 at Philippa in the Scottish Lowlands. He was overpowered by the returning Covenanter forces, no longer required by Parliament after their victory at Naseby.
With the defeat of Montrose, the royalist cause in Scotland collapsed. In Oxford, Charles considered his limited options. Of his 3 kingdoms, now only the Catholics of Ireland gave him hope.
Charles thought a full ceasefire with the Irish Catholic rebels, the Confederates, and a transfer of Irish troops to Britain was what he needed to win the war against Parliament. And as Catholics, the Confederates were far more sympathetic to the king than to the Puritan Parliament.
Charles sent an envoy to deal directly with the Irish Catholics. In exchange for 20,000 of their troops, Charles promised the Catholics official toleration of their faith and greater political freedom.
This was a crucial move. All that the parliamentarians had feared before the war even started, that the king would introduce Catholicism onto these shores, now seemed true.
But before Charles could receive any troops from Ireland, the port of Chester fell to the Roundheads, squashing any hope of Catholic reinforcements getting to England. The plan failed.
Charles had become the Mr. Micawber of the Civil War, always hoping something would turn up. He conjured up all sorts of scenarios for a grand anti-parliamentary alliance involving Scottish, Irish and French forces. Any plan, however crackpot, would get his endorsement. But so far, everything had fallen through. And after a miserable winter in Oxford, receiving almost nothing but bad news, Charles cracked. He decided to run for it.
Late on the evening of April 27, 1646, Charles had his hair cut short and put on a suit of plain brown clothes. Accompanied by 2 loyal courtiers, he slipped into the night disguised as a servant. It wouldn't be long before the Roundheads were hunting Charles down. The king was to become a fugitive in his own kingdom. In April 1646, at the height of the English Civil War, 3 men in disguise fled Oxford. But these men were not deserters or criminals. One of them was King Charles I. Accompanied by 2 loyal courtiers, he hurried through the night, hoping to flee the country. Parliament immediately issued orders for his arrest. The King of England, Ireland and Scotland was now a fugitive.
Charles's predicament couldn't have been worse. This most self-important of kings was reduced to scurrying around his kingdom in the dead of the night, disguised as a servant.
In 1640, Charles I had started a civil war over religion and the power of monarchy. In Scotland, the war degenerated into a clan feud, while in Ireland, the conflict ignited sectarian hatred between Catholics and Protestants. In England, set-piece battles between Roundheads and Cavaliers killed thousands. But by 1646, the Royalist Cavaliers were spent as a military force, and Parliament's Roundheads were closing in on the king.
A As Charles fled through the night, he found himself travelling in the fens of East Anglia. This dark, brooding landscape was home to his most deadly enemy, the brilliant commander of the Roundheads, Oliver Cromwell. A man who was absolutely determined to end the war of the last 4 years, the war which had now ravaged England, Ireland and Scotland.
Charles had hit rock bottom. After weeks on the run, the king ended up here in Norfolk, at the Swan pub in Downham Market. As he burned private papers in his room, King Charles despaired over his next move.
Charles knew he could expect little mercy from Cromwell, so instead he made an extraordinary decision. After 4 days holed up here in this small town deep inside enemy territory, he chose to hand himself in to the very people he had gone to war with in the beginning, Parliament's allies, the Scottish Covenanters.
9 years earlier, these men had signed a covenant rejecting the king's religious reforms in Scotland. The Scottish Covenanters had fought alongside Parliament to defend their Protestant religion, but now they feared the growing religious extremism of Parliament, and the alliance between them began to crumble. Charles realised he was facing a divided opposition.
Ever the opportunist, Charles saw his surrender to the Scottish Covenanters as a way of splitting the alliance fighting against him. To Charles, it was just another tactic towards reclaiming what was rightfully his.
Accompanied by 2 loyal courtiers, Charles set out across the flat fen landscape of East Anglia.
At 6 a.m. on May the 5th, 1646, the king surrendered himself to the Scottish Covenanters, who were laying siege to the royalist town of Newark. But as ever in the wars of the 1640s, events in another kingdom could upset the best laid plans. With the king in their possession, the Covenanter-Parliament alliance seemed triumphant. But in Ireland, Charles's allies, the Confederates, achieved an astounding victory that would totally upset the Covenanter-Parliament plans.
In June 1646, the Catholic Confederates hammered the Protestants at the Battle of Ben Burb. Ireland had been ravaged by 5 years of civil war between these 2 opposing religions. Parliament had backed the Protestants, while Charles had eventually allied himself with the Catholics. The Catholic victory at Ben Burb in Ireland terrified both the Roundheads and the Scottish Covenanters. In the face of this Catholic victory, Parliament and the Covenanters settled their differences. The deal was sealed when Parliament bought the king from the Covenanters for £400,000. Cheap at the price, Charles remarked. The king was taken to Holdenby House in Northamptonshire.
Despite Charles's military and political incapacity, he was still crucial to finding a settlement to the civil wars. In an age of monarchy, no solution to the troubles of the 1640s seemed possible without him. So, whoever controlled the king controlled the political agenda. Though Charles was technically a prisoner here at Holdenby House, he was still the king and expected to be treated as such. During his 5-month stay, he enjoyed the services of almost 100 staff, including 16 kitchen staff with 2 pastry chefs, 2 chaplains, 6 grooms of the bedchamber, 1 hairdresser, and numerous others, including physicians, apothecaries, and robe makers. It was hardly porridge.
While Charles was living it up at Holdenby, a new political player had emerged in the Civil War. The new model army was becoming increasingly militant. The troops believed they had served Parliament well by defeating a tyrannical king and preventing a Catholic takeover. Their resentment was further fuelled by the months of back pay they were still owed. When rumours began to circulate in the camps that they might be packed off to Ireland, they suspected Parliament was negotiating a secret deal with the king.
The new model army believed itself on a divine mission, and they expected a hero's welcome at the end of it, not the stitch-up prepared by Parliament. This fusion of political and religious radicalism came together in a powerful statement of principle. We were not a mere mercenary army called forth to serve any arbitrary power of a state, but had taken up arms to fight for our rights and liberties, to assert and to vindicate the just power and rights of this kingdom.
Parliament wanted rid of its troublesome new model army, who were now blocking any possible deal with the king. But it was the army who moved first.
On June the 2nd, Charles was enjoying a pleasant day playing bowls with his two parliamentary guards, when a junior officer from the army, Cornet Joyce, rode up to Holdenbury House with 2 troops of cavalry and demanded the king accompany him. Asked by what right he importuned the monarch, Joyce showed Charles his 500 well-armed cavalrymen. The king acquiesced. He was now in the hands of the army. Charles went along with the army and, as their prisoner, hoped to further the army's growing differences with Parliament. In the face of such splits, he refused to countenance any settlements or negotiations. Charles hoped to divide his enemies, turn them on each other, and walk away in triumph.
But an increasing number of people were now toying with truly revolutionary ideas, none more so than the soldier-turned-activist John Lilburne. He argued that since all men were equal before God, so they should be equal before the law. Lilburne and his followers became known as the Levellers. They demanded the Church of England be divorced from the state, the end of press censorship, and above all the vote, but only for men.
All this talk of equality, democracy and justice was music to the ears of a disgruntled and weary army. These levellers seemed to have the answer to all their problems, and Lilburne's ideas swept like wildfire through the camps, especially his notion that Parliament was in fact just as corrupt as the king.
Cromwell saw Lilburne as a dangerous radical, but Lilburne was extremely popular among the rank and file of the new model army, so against his will, Cromwell was forced to debate the Leveller Manifesto. The debates took place in Putney, on the outskirts of London.
It was here at Putney Church that a battle of ideas took place that have influenced our politics to this day. Ideas which led men to demand a say over their future, over their politics and communities and how their money was spent. You could say that this was the birthplace of British socialism, the right of the lowliest individual to have a say in the shape of their society. It was the beginning of a process that would eventually end in votes for all. In October 1647, the General Council of the Army met to debate these issues. On one side, the Levellers argued for an extension of the vote to nearly all men. In the immortal words of Colonel Rainsborough, "I think the poorest he in England has a life to live as the greatest he." These were truly radical ideas, the right to vote, the right to bring those in power to account. But on the other side sat Cromwell and the socially conservative army grandees. As a substantial landowner, Cromwell had always believed in private property and insisted that only property holders with a fixed permanent interest, in other words, those with a substantial amount of real estate, should have the right to vote.
In the end, the leveller demands were just too radical for Cromwell and the army grandees. The debates were wound up, and when rebellion flared up again, Cromwell's reaction was swift and merciless. At one army camp, some of the levellers were taken out and shot.
The message couldn't be clearer. This was not a debating society, it was an army. The new model army was built on discipline, and that was needed now more than ever, because Charles had escaped. On November the 11th, 1647, Charles gave his guards the slip and headed south for the coast, where a boat was waiting to take him to Jersey. There was, however, one problem with this plan: the New Forest. In its maze of trees and paths, Charles got hopelessly lost. By the time they arrived at the coast, news of the escape was out, and Charles was forced to accept a highly unsatisfactory backup plan: the Isle of Wight. There, he was immediately taken into captivity by the parliamentary governor of the island. It was a strategic disaster. Charles's position now seemed utterly hopeless. Yet it didn't stop him plotting.
Charles had few friends left in England, and his Catholic supporters in Ireland were now in retreat. But in a last desperate gamble, Charles entered into an extraordinary alliance with his old enemy, the Scottish Covenanters. The new model army was a hotbed of the most extreme Protestant ideas of the day, which the Scottish Covenanters saw as a threat to their own church. It was this fear that drove them into the arms of King Charles.
Charles and the Covenanters came together for a final fling. In December 1647, they signed the engagement and set in train another wave of conflict. The three kingdoms were back on the path towards total war. But the Second Civil War would be nothing like so finely balanced as the first.
A second civil war began in March 1648 with a pro-royalist uprising. Across the country, communities resentful of Parliament's taxes and authoritarian style of government rose up against the new model army. The Scottish Covenanters marched into England to fight for the king. But at the Battle of Preston, they proved no match for Cromwell's troops. As Cromwell brutally suppressed the rebellion in England, a revengeful mood gripped the new model army. There was now a desperate desire to stop Charles once and for all. In December 1648, Charles was transferred by the Roundheads from the Isle of Wight to Hurst Castle on the south coast.
Engineering the Second Civil War was the worst thing Charles could have done. It sealed his fate. For the new model army, the will of God had been shown in the First Civil War, when the Roundheads beat the Cavaliers on the field of battle. By plunging the country back into civil war, Charles was seen to be not only an irresponsible king with little regard for the well-being of his people, but also, crucially, defying the judgment of God. And for that sin, he needed to be called to account.
Jutting out into the sea, Hurst Castle is a pretty grim place. Isolated and windswept, it was a far cry from the comforts of Holdenby House. There are no pastry chefs or grooms of the bedchamber here.
Locked in his dank cell at Hurst Castle, Charles must have realised his time was up and started to think about preserving the principle of monarchy. Old adversaries came to him with favourable treaties, offering Charles a way out. But he refused to accept any deal which placed fundamental limitations on his power as an absolute monarch. Charles was king by divine right and would live or die as such. As he said, "I am resolved rather to shipwreck my person than either my conscience or beliefs." The game plan had now changed. Charles was determined to play the martyr.
With all his comforts withdrawn, Charles's only solace was a daily 2-mile walk along the narrow shingle spit that connected his jail to the mainland. Here, Charles must have contemplated the disastrous consequences of his actions.
For us to believe what we believe, we must have some basis. The women are tainted.
The new model army wanted no more negotiations or deals with such an untrustworthy king. At a prayer meeting in Windsor, the troops were defiant. They agreed that it was our duty, if ever the Lord brought us back again in peace, to call King Charles I, that man of blood, to an account for that blood he had shed against the Lord's cause. The new model army wanted justice. In fact, they wanted his head. The job of eliminating the king was given to Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton. Ireton was a radical Puritan and a ruthless operator. But he realised if the king was simply assassinated, there would be popular uproar. Ireton needed an official stamp of approval, and so presented to Parliament a bill demanding Charles be tried on the charge of treason. But there were some in Parliament who still hoped for a negotiated settlement with the king. They had to go.
Ireton did what so many military coup leaders do. He rigged the system to give the army a veneer of legitimacy. On the 6th of December 1648, he purged Parliament of all opposition. He ordered Colonel Pride of the new model army to stand in front of the House of Commons and turn away any member likely to resist. It was simple. If your name wasn't down, you weren't getting in.
Around 140 MPs were prevented from entering the Commons. Another 40 were arrested. This was a nasty little coup, as squalid and brutal as anything in Iraq or Burma today. All that was left was a rump parliament of 56 MPs, ready and willing to carry out the army's every wish. The trial of Charles I was like putting a man on the moon. At the time, it seemed simply inconceivable, so when it did happen, it changed everything.
All the old views of divine right and kingship were thrown away. The world had now been turned completely upside down. Ideas about monarchy, government, parliament, all of these would never be the same again.
Charles was brought to London, and on the 20th of January 1648, a High Court of Justice convened in Westminster Hall. The charge was that Charles I had attempted to subvert the ancient and fundamental laws and liberties of this nation, and in their place to introduce an arbitrary and tyrannical government, and hath prosecuted it with fire and sword.
How on earth could a king commit treason? Surely Charles couldn't commit a crime against himself. But the court argued the king was separate from the kingdom, and by levying war against Parliament and the English people, Charles had indeed committed treason.
Parliament now saw itself, not the king, as representing the will of the people.
The king was told he was answerable to Parliament as the sovereign and highest court of justice, the sole maker of the law. Charles answered, "I am your king. I have a trust committed to me by God.
I will not betray that trust to answer to a new, unlawful authority. Again and again, he returned to the issue of legitimacy. By what authority was he being tried? This was a fascinating debate, a defining moment in our nation's history, a clash of ideas between king and parliament, between monarchy and democracy. Charles's defence was ignored, and after 5 days the verdict was delivered. The king was condemned by the court as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. He was to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. A kangaroo court of a military junta had taken upon itself the right of life and death over the nation's monarch. This was not a triumph of republican ideology, it was political necessity, pure and simple. The verdict had been sealed months beforehand. For war to end, Charles had to go. The death warrant was drawn up. Yet despite the guilty verdict, many of the judges either fled or hesitated before committing their names. Less than half of the court signed the warrant. But Cromwell forced it through, even holding one man's wavering hand. On the morning of January the 30th, 1649, King Charles I awoke here at St James's Palace. At 5 a.m, he rose, prayed and requested 2 shirts. The weather was bitterly cold, and Charles didn't want people to think he was shivering through fear. He groomed and dressed immaculately, readying himself for his betrothal to God and the future of monarchy. At 10 a.m, an armed guard came for him. Charles strode across St James's Park, through Horse Guards Parade, and then entered Whitehall. He marched on to Banqueting House. In front of it stood a scaffold, draped in black. At 2 p.m, Charles walked out of this window at Banqueting House onto the scaffold. He said, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." He tucked his hair under a white satin cap and lay down his head on the executioner's block. His last word was "remember." His head was struck from his body in one fell swipe. As his severed head was held aloft, a low, awful groan came up from the crowd. Through military genius and dogged energy, Cromwell achieved what Charles always wanted, and, ironically, a lot of what Cromwell had originally taken up arms against. The creation of a single British state. But Cromwell's Commonwealth was not the republic that levellers and religious freedom fighters had hoped for. It was a war state of soulless oppression, an England where even Christmas and maypoles were banned, Scotland governed from London and drained of resources, and Ireland viciously oppressed by an occupying force. Even the Westminster Parliament was soon disbanded, replaced by Cromwell's protectorate or dictatorship. Was this really a state worth fighting for? The civil wars were the product of political failure. And it was a failure that cost 250,000 lives. The system of monarchy of the early 17th century simply couldn't accommodate the competing religious dogmas of England, Ireland and Scotland, especially under such a hapless king as Charles I. We shouldn't see the Civil War in the same light as the great revolutions which took place in France and Russia. The revolution here did not produce any long-term change in the state. In 1660, when Charles II retook the throne, almost everything was returned to its pre-Civil War status. I think the lasting and universal bequest of the civil wars was not political, but intellectual.
In an era of devolution and self-government, England, Scotland and Ireland are once again debating the precise nature of the relationship between them. At a time of growing republicanism, the legitimacy of monarchy is being called into question once more, and the basis for electoral franchise, the principle of religious toleration, the ideal of socialism, all appeared for the first time during the revolutionary frenzy of the 1640s.
These ideas profoundly influenced the history of the British state over the following centuries, but they also went abroad. The debates and ideas of the Civil War can be seen at work across the world, and that's why it remains the most fascinating period of our island's history. For a free study guide about the Civil War and listings of other Open University programmes, you can visit our website at open2.net/Civil War or call us on 0870 900 0312.